Right, let's now talk about creating background blur, or the bokeh effect in Redshift. I think I can easily say that this is my favorite tool in all of Redshift. You'll see why I say this in just a moment. Let's go and select the Redshift tag, and I'll go to the bokeh tab. I'll first override it, as we talked about in the previous lessons, and then I'll enable this as well. As soon as I enable this, the first thing Redshift does is to look at the settings of this camera to derive the focus settings. So it's looking at the focus distance, as well as the circle of confusion, or the blur amount if you like, from this camera. For example, if I select this camera, and then go to the Object tab, I can then come down to, let's say, focus distance, click on this, and then point this at, let's say, this bulb here. That automatically sets the distance between the camera and the light bulb here. Or if I click on this arrow, I can go and click on, let's say, the jar in the background, and this updates it, so that the jar is what the camera is focusing on. I can, however, go to this tag, and tell Redshift not to look at the settings of the camera by changing this to none. And now I can manually go and set my focus distance, as well as my circle of confusion radius. Now the focus distance is calculated from the camera to the object, or a plane actually, that you're focusing on. The thing that you focus on is always going to be a plane. Let me come out of this camera. But I actually want this to be locked to that camera's view. So if I go to the camera here, and then I lock that view. If I zoom back out from here, you see now this camera is focusing on this section. So if I go to focus settings and derive from camera just the focus distance, that tells Redshift to look at this plane here to focus on. So if I go to the camera settings and change the focus distance, now Redshift is going to focus on that plane, which happens to be on those picture frames in the background. You can see that's what's in focus now. And if I want to get the other things to be out of focus even more, so everything apart from this plane here, or this plane, to be out of focus even more, I can go to the Redshift tag, come down to Bokeh, and increase the circle of confusion radius. As I increase this, you'll see things that are blurry will be even blurrier. And as I go to my camera settings, and if I change my focus distance, let's say here, I'm now focusing on different parts. Let's say if I focus on those birds, like that. That's what's in focus now. But you see, this is quite tricky to get exactly right. So Redshift has an amazing tool to help you focus exactly on what you need to focus. Let me show you. I'm going to go to the tag and tell Redshift not to derive anything from the camera. So I'm going to go and set this to none. And if I want to focus on, let's say, just this bird here on the left-hand side, I can go and click on this button here, which will interactively focus the camera. So if I go and click on this, and if I go and click on the bird here, that sets the focus distance to be exactly how far the bird is, or that point is, from your camera. If I now go and click on, let's say, this jar in the background, that's the thing that's going to be in focus now. If I click on the leaves here, they'll be in focus. So as long as this button is turned on, you can click anywhere on the render, and Redshift will focus just there. And this option here, the circle of confusion radius, is effectively how strong your blur effect is. So as I increase this, things will be even blurrier. And I can decrease this so that the effect isn't as extreme. Let me now go into that camera and then fly to a different angle, let's say here. This effect works great when you have close-up shots like this. So there's some stuff in front of the camera, quite close, and some farther away, like these. If I now go and click on those leaves, that's what now Redshift focuses on. So it focuses on these. Let me actually fly to a slightly different angle, let's say here. And if I now go and click here to focus, that's what Redshift is going to focus on. But this is such a shallow depth of field, so I think this is a bit too extreme. So I'll go to circle of confusion radius and lower this down a little. So I get some detail in the background back. And if I click here, let's say, it focuses back on just that point. Looking at this now, I think this is still a little too extreme, so I'll just go and lower this down even more. And then maybe change my angle slightly, so I can see some more of these leaves. And then click back on these leaves here, so they get in focus, and everything else in the background is blurrier. I can of course go and click on these pictures in the background, So they become sharp and everything else will become blurry. I can click on this jar. So that's the main thing that's in focus and everything else is quite blurry. Let me zoom out a little more. And in fact, I can go to a slightly wider angle lens. So if I go to the camera, change my focal length to, let's say, a wide angle lens. And if I now zoom in, I can see some more of the background there as well. So I was trying to see the top of these leaves, as you can see here. Let me zoom out just a tiny bit more. And then maybe tilt the head of the camera up, like that. So we now have these leaves and the fallen branches on the floor in front of us, and everything else in the background becomes sharp. Just to be sure, because I've moved the camera around, I'm going to make sure that this button here is turned on, and then just go and click on the jar again. That now focuses on the jar. Or of course, if I go and click here, this becomes in focus, and everything else in the background is blurry. Let's go and talk about some more bokeh settings here. I'll go and select the Redshift tag, come down to bokeh. Let me increase the circle of confusion radius so I can explain the rest of these options a bit better. So I'm going to go push this up. Let's say there maybe. And the next option is power. What power does is it adds some holes inside your areas that are blurry. So for example, if I go and increase the power, you see these bits, which were only blurry and round, now have these holes inside. Let me actually go and set a region here so it only renders a certain area. Let's say if we move this here. So if I now go to power, increase this, and if I increase the circle of confusion radius as well, you see that's what's happening now. So I'm getting these holes inside those circles. With lower power, you have fewer holes there, or shallower holes, so you see the holes aren't as big. And as you dial this all the way down, that just turns off the entire effect. So you need to have some power together with your circle of confusion for this effect to start showing. So I'm going to go and push this up a little more, like that. We then have the aspect, which changes how wide these circles are. So if I go and push this towards right, you see they're more elliptical, sideways. As I push this towards left, they're more vertical, like that. Let me go and kill this render region here. So everything is going to be more vertical. And as I increase the aspect, things become more sideways, horizontal. Let me go and set this back to 1. And next we have the blade count. This is quite interesting. If the blade count is set to 0, these shapes are going to be perfect circles. But as I increase these, let's see what happens. If I go and set this to 3, let's say, instead of seeing circles, I now have triangles where those blurry areas were. If I go to, let's say, 4, that's going to be a rectangle. 5 is going to give you a pentagon, and then you'll have an hexagon, and so on. You can also change the blade angle. So if I go and increase this, you see that we'll just rotate these blades here. Just to make this a little more obvious, I'll go to a different angle. Let's say if I go fly back, and I'll increase the circle of confusion radius. And let me fly to an even more extreme angle, let's say here, where we have some HDR image showing through the background as well. So we get these highlights here. I'll lower down the power so that the holes aren't as big inside. And I'll increase the circle of confusion even more. So these are getting even blurrier. And let me render just this region here by pressing R on the keyboard. So that's the same as clicking this button. And then I'll place it here. And as I change the blade angle, you see these will rotate. Now, in order to see this a little better, I'm actually going to go and set this to be 3. So we get triangles here. And as I rotate the blade angle, you see those triangles will be rotating. And that's what the angle here does. Let me increase this a little more so it's even more obvious, like that. And as I increase the blade angle, you see those triangles are now rotating. I'll set this back to 6, so we have a hexagon shape there, which is quite common. And another interesting thing you can do is that you can actually use your custom image as your bokeh image. So if I go and turn this on, and then come down to the path, and pick an image. Let's say if I go and pick this heart bokeh here, which is just a heart shape, so that's what it looks like. If I pick that up, and then I'm not going to copy this again. So we now have these hearts here. Let me go and kill this render region. And if I now fly to a bit more of a sensible angle, let's say here, And of course, everything is now out of focus. So let me go to my automatic focusing tool here and then click on, let's say, the picture frame there. And I'll also lower down my circle of confusion radius so it's not as crazily blurred as it is now. Maybe actually let's go and click on something closer, like this bird. And one thing you'll notice, apart from the bokeh shapes turning into these hearts, is that the overall image became a bit too dark. That's because it's using the black and white image here, and the black bits here are actually making the image dark. To compensate for that, you can go to the normalization mode and change it from none to unit intensity. And this makes sure that the black bits don't cause any darkening effect on your overall render. I'll go to the circle of confusion radius again, lower this down a little more. And if you now go to a different angle, let's say a close-up of these leaves again. And if I click here, it focuses on this. This is a bit too extreme again, so I'll lower this down. And that's what I'm getting now. And actually I'm going to click here to focus more on the front side here. And then decrease the CLC. So we get a deeper or a greater depth of field. And now we have these heart shapes as well. Using the same method, but a different image this time, we can also create what's called chromatic aberration. So if I go to the path here, pick up a different image, which is this guy here. Let me show you what this looks like. This is our image. And I just created this simply in Photoshop by adding a few objects here and then setting their modes to lighten. And if I use that image here, this is the result that we get. If I now zoom back out, let's say here, and if I focus on the birds here, you see we now have some chromatic aberration. And aberration is a phenomena where light disperses rather than being focused on one point. And different wavelengths disperse differently. Because of this image that I've used, the left side here is always going to be green, so the left side of the blurry bits will always be green. And the right side will always be this bluish, magenta-ish tint. And that's what I'm getting here as well. You can actually create your own chromatic aberration image, so you don't need to use 3 colors like this. So if I switch back to Photoshop, for example, I can delete all of these, and then create one layer, and then fill this layer by right-clicking and then going to blending options, or I could have double-clicked as well, fill it with a gradient overlay. And in that, I'm going to click on the gradient here, and then make this go from, let's say, red to white to blue. If I press OK, so if I go and fill this layer with any color, so I just press Ctrl backspace to fill it with the background color, I can use this as my chromatic aberration. But usually, chromatic aberrations happen from left to right. So let me go and change my gradient angle. If I change the angle here to 0, if I now save this as, I'll call this one chromatic aberration 2. If I switch back to cinema, change that image to the second one. I don't want to copy it. Now that will eliminate the green from this. So it only has the left side being red and the right side being blue. Now this oversaturates the image, as you can see, and this option here under normalization mode where it says white color sum will compensate for that weird looking saturation effect. So as a result of using an image, if you get this weird looking saturated result, you just change your normalization mode to white color sum, and that will eliminate this strange looking result. So it will desaturate the image where it needs to. But we still have the effect. On the left hand side, we have the more reddish tints of those blurry bits, and then on the right hand side, we have the more bluish tints. And in the middle, since the color here is white, we don't have any effect. So if I go and increase the circle of confusion radius, I should be able to exaggerate this result. And you get this beautiful looking chromatic aberration result. I'm going to focus on the picture frames in the background here. And change my framing as well a little bit. Let's say there. And refocus on that picture frame in the back. I think this is a little too extreme now, so I'm going to go to the depth of field amount or the COC radius, lower this down so it's not as extreme as it was before. And that's the bokeh effect in Redshift. I hope you now understand why I said that this was my favorite effect in all of Redshift. Stay tuned and I'll see you in the next lesson where we'll talk about animating the depth of field.